Hello everyone, welcome back.
Today's story is from our /AskReddit. People asked, what family secret was finally spilled in your family? Story 1. Found out my uncle is actually my brother. My mom had him when she was so young that my grandparents raised him. Story 2. My sister cheated on her husband throughout her entire marriage to the point that all 3 of her kids have different biological fathers. Story 3. When my mother fell ill and I took over her finances, I found thousands of pounds of gambling debt on her credit cards. Then I found adoption papers for a child she'd had before me that she'd never mentioned. Then another family member told me my dad didn't die in a car crash, but unalived himself in prison. Story 4. My grandma doesn't drive. And I thought she couldn't, but it was just never discussed. One day when I was maybe 7 to 8, I'd been trying to get anyone to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle. Grandma lived with them. They had Bit-O honey at the local store, which I could no longer get at home. But no one would take me to the store. Finally, I said I'd just ask Grandma, and my cousin chimes in with, Grandma can't drive. Oh, you bet you're sweet, I can drive. They just don't let me. Grandma had overheard, and she was in high dudgeon. But that's all that was said about it, and my aunt finally took me to the store, so I forgot about it. Years later, when I'd just gotten my license, I asked my mom what was up with Grandma not driving. She explained that during Prohibition, Grandma bootlegged alcohol for moonshiners. She was very successful at it. She was so successful at it that when the moonshiners were finally busted, even though the revenuers never caught my grandma, her license was suspended by the state to never be reissued. Later in life, she was told she could petition for it back, but it came with an admission of guilt or some such. She told M to go to F off. Story 5. After my grandfather passed, we found out he had fathered a child when he was posted in Italy during World War II. He never knew. His mother intercepted any letters from the Italian girl. He came home, met and married my grandmother, and had 4 children. I forget who in the family found out and how. It's crazy to think we have a whole Italian family out there. Edit. To clarify, I'm in the UK, not that it's relevant to the story. My oldest aunt is 77, so this kid would be at least 79 by now, I would think. We've considered doing the DNA testing, but some family members aren't comfortable with how those companies could use the information. It's a really sad story, but if his mother hadn't intercepted the letters, I wouldn't exist. It's a weird place to be in emotionally. Story 6. My aunt wasn't my grandfather's child. He met my granny when my aunt was a very sick infant. She had polio and wasn't expected to survive. My granddad married my granny, so she could get on his insurance and move to an area that had proper medical support. My aunt was the first infant to survive open-heart surgery at Yale New Haven Hospital, and although she had to be in leg braces most of her childhood, she had a great life. My granddad loved her like she was his own, and I never knew about it until she went to her biological dad's funeral when I was a teenager. Story 7. A relative of mine did not just fall off a bridge with her baby, she jumped. It seems obvious in hindsight, but they reported it differently both in the news and to our younger family members. Story 8. I used to work in a field dealing with preventing and living oneself, and even though some may see the passing as a result of it, a lot of family members and loved ones have a very difficult time coping with the idea that the victim passed due to whatever circumstances, especially when children are involved. This is not uncommon to report differently, as it is not something a lot of families are able to come to terms with, and understandably. I am really sorry to hear about your relative, though, and I hope some of the wounds have somewhat healed over time. Story 9. My grandmother recently passed. She was famous in our town for her amazing cooking, in particular her turkey dinners. Notably, her gravy was absolutely amazing. It's so delicious. She had a heart attack several years ago, and her near-death experience. I tried to convince her to share some of her secret recipes with me, all except for her gravy recipe. When she passed away this spring, I was going through her pantry and found an entire bucket of KFC gravy mix. She was literally using KFC gravy mix as a base to make her incredible gravy. Huge scandal. LMAO. Story 10. It started from me having problems with my teeth. Spontaneous abscess that resulted in multiple root canals. My dentist did some looking into what the cause might be and found some really odd abnormalities with my incisors, roots, and nerves, so he sent out requests for help to a couple of professors he knew in the field. When my next appointment came up, he was really quiet for a bit before verbally stumbling about it. Turns out that what was happening with my teeth was a classic sign of inbreeding, and he was super uncomfortable giving me the news. I brought it up to my mom, and she just was like, "Oh well, yeah, didn't you know? WTF?" Of course I didn't know. Turns out that not very far back in the family tree, Several of my relatives decided that it was a good idea to get married to one another, and no one bothered to mention it. Ever. The small town where I live is 85% my relatives, no joke. I hadn't even met all of them, that's how many they are. Edit. I had made a big point of going far away from my hometown to meet my now husband because I was afraid of having children with someone that might be my cousin. Only to find out 5 years after we had been married that I was in fact a product of inbreeding. My husband and I are not related at all. Both my mother's side and my father's side came from small towns where the population was predominantly family, i.e. the families had lived there since the town had been settled. So there is a good chance that there had been some inter-cousin shenanigans on both sides, though no names from my mother's side showed up in my father's family tree. Story 11. My grandfather was an atomic soldier. Instead of sending him to fight in the Korean War, they sent him to Nevada, where he witnessed the mushroom cloud. After that was over, he was ordered to march to the detonation point, where he was unwittingly exposed to high amounts of radiation. Luckily for my family, my grandpa is now in his 90s and the rest of us are cancer-free and fairly healthy, but this is medical information that we really should have known earlier. Story 12. After my mom died, I found out the real story behind my parents' marriage. She came to my father's country to visit some of her relatives. Met my father, and after just 1 week she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father accepted because he had no one else, and his parents were pressing him to get married already. But the highlight of the story is that over some time, the two of them fell in love with each other. Their love only grew over the time, and they were really happy together. My mother spent her last days very ill, and she would accept only my father by her bedside. He swears to this day that she was an angel sent from heaven to take care of him. I am shocked that they got married just like that, out of the blue, and ended up loving each other so deeply. I can only hope to have as good and loving marriage as they had. Story 13. My dad got a girl pregnant, and the girl decided to go with it alone. She moved across the state and had my half-sister. She then met a guy, married, and he raised her like she was his own. They had no other children. She didn't reveal my dad's identity until after he died. Apparently, she contacted my grandma and mom, but they kept it from us. Years later, half-sister has a kid with medical issues and needs to know family medical history. She contacts mom and grandma, who, again, didn't tell us. Meanwhile, after dad died, my uncle had prints made of his favorite picture of dad. He gets them framed and gives them to all us kids, as well as my grandma, aunts, and uncles. Mom gets a picture to our half-sister after their secret meeting. Fast forward another few years. My brother and his roommate live in a nearby large city and hit a bar and picked up and brought home some ladies to sleep over. The next morning, my half-sister sees a photo of my dad on the mantle, turns white, and asks, "Whose picture is that?" "That's my roommate's dad. He died a long time ago." "I need to talk to your roommate." That's how we found out. My brother went to my grandma and asked about her, and grandma first denied it, then gave in and spilled the beans. Small world. Story 14. Due to 23andMe, my dad learned that his recently deceased father was not his biological father. It wasn't a situation related to my grandma cheating either. It was a sperm donation. So, they knew this was the case in his entire life. Pretty crazy that they never told him. His parents did not pass until he was 65 years old. Talk about a curveball. Story 15. One of my friends did 23andMe and discovered she had 185 half-siblings she didn't know about. The fertility doctor her mom had gone to was just using his own sperm and not telling anyone if a couple was having trouble conceiving because of the father. What's even crazier is that apparently he was not the only fertility doctor doing this. A couple of other superclusters of siblings have been found because of DNA testing. In most cases, the parents had no idea this had happened until their kids got DNA testing done. Story 16. After I was SA'd by my uncle, it came out he had done this to one of my other sister, and my family covered it up, particularly my mother. Now I know why my sister didn't like how close my uncle got to me when I was younger. Story 17. We went to my grandmother's for Christmas dinner like we did every year, and my uncle drank too much and kind of hinted that he had an affair with my mother. A couple of months and 2 DNA tests later, we found out my sister is actually his daughter. My dad never spoke to his brother again. And of course, my parents got divorced, and I needed a lot of therapy and chocolate. Gosh, we are trash. Story 18. When my sister was diagnosed with cancer and her survival chances were low, it inevitably came out that she wasn't my sister. Parents must have felt we should all know the truth just in case. She survived her treatment and will always be my sister. Story 19. My mom and older brother are not biologically related to me. My biological mom passed away sometime after I was born, leaving me, my sister, and my dad behind. My brother was the one that told me. My parents never told me because they wanted to protect me from the truth, but my brother thought that was a BS reason for me to not know. I don't know if my parents know that I know the truth, but I don't want to bring it up either. Edit. My mom immigrated here along with my older brother when he was a kid. My dad also immigrated here, and my sister and I were born after he came. I don't know much about our family history beyond that. My brother revealed this info around when I was 18. He isn't the type to lie about something like this. He also said my sister is apparently aware of the truth because she has a memory of my biological mom being in physical contact with her. I don't think too differently about my family because of this. My mom is still my mom. Story 20. My uncles were infamous criminals who outlived multiple people. I thought they were breed dogs. Story 21. I met my wife when her daughter was 16 months old. Bio dad was never in the picture. Once it was looking like a relationship that would last, we got married and briefly toyed with the idea of just never telling her. She was around 3 to 4 at this time. Ultimately, we decided that it would be better to not hide it, though that has created some issues with her now half-siblings and some self-esteem issues. I just felt that her potentially finding this out as an adult might be pretty traumatizing and F-up. It's a pretty big lie of omission, and I just wasn't comfortable with it. Also as important, I believe, for medical history-related things she'll encounter later in life. Lastly, it gives Bio Dad the chance to do an about-face, perhaps as unlikely as that may be, and get to know his daughter without the massive trauma of an unspoken lie being brought into play. To ease into it, when she was around 4 years old, I started saying things to her like, "After I met you and Mommy," and insert situation happened before I met you and Mommy. She was able to put 2 and 2 together as time progressed, so it wouldn't have to be a sit-down confession, but rather a more evolutionary realization which we guided her through. Story 22. My mother often had stories like, "At your age, we got up at 4 a.m. to work on the farm. After the job, we went home to have lunch with your grandfather. Then we walked 10 kilometers to go to school. And when we were back, we used to work in the field in a tractor until it was 6 p.m. to go and cook dinner for your grandfather." And me like, "Yeah, but he didn't work the farm with you in the morning." And she was changing the subject. I learned in Easter that my grandfather was alcoholic, got drunk every night, didn't get up in the morning to go to work, or was in fake jobs to lie to the family, and then go to drink, while the children had to go to elementary school and manage a farm. Then he was in prison because he touched the neighbor's children. When he got out of prison, he took out a loan of $30,000 in my grandmother's name and ran away with the money. Then he passed away a few years later. My grandmother bought herself a used Ford LTD, and no one cried at the funeral. 30 years later, I learned who my grandfather was. Story 23. When I was 28, I found out that my dad was not my biological father. The news came out via the following. First, my dad was battling depression and was suicidal, so I had just flown home to try to take care of him and rescue him from my mom's wrath. My mom had verbally and emotionally abused him during their entire relationship. He loved her so much, and he tolerated it. Well, during a solemn walk with my dad, as I tried to help him out, he confided that he's not my biological dad, and he went on to tell me he knew this all along, but my mom lied to him and tried to convince him that he was my biological father. He knew he wasn't, but he wanted to play the role. When I was 10 years old, my mom finally confessed this to him, and he was worried that upon hearing the news officially, he'd somehow let this affect his relationship with me. So when I was 28 years old, during this walk with my dad, as he pours out this story to me, he frames it by telling me that his 2 most proud items in his life are 1. How I turned out by him raising me. 2. That he had completely forgot about the news my mom told him earlier, about him not being my biological father, and that it was only upon tucking me in at night that it will briefly crossed his mind. It was at that point that he knew nothing would ever come between us, and our father-son relationship would be as awesome as ever. He also confided that my mom did hard drugs while pregnant with me, and this broke his heart to witness firsthand. They were very poor. My dad grew up in a foster home without parents. My mom grew up with 6 siblings and ill-equipped parents. She dropped out of 9th grade, whereas all of her other siblings dropped out earlier. Many of them are barely literate. I'm now mid-30s, and tragically, my dad outlived himself mid-March 2020, right as COVID was hitting. I was out of the country at the time, but immediately flew 30 hours with only 30-minute layover and made it in time for his funeral. I will always do everything in his honor. Story 24. Last week I discovered that my dad passed away 2 years ago, and no one bothered to tell me. I'd been looking for him. He was something off a drifter and most likely had Asperger's. I'm his only child. I stumbled across his headstone on findagrave.com while digging through Ancestry. His marker was labeled Beloved Brother. My aunts and uncles are pieces of garbage. I'm not hard to find. I don't even know how he passed away. He must have died alone, though. VA paid for his burial. I'm not okay. Edit. My dad was a good guy. He had his demons, and my mother was one of them. Our estrangement wasn't his fault. I'm my father's daughter, and I say that proudly. I'm a veteran like he was, I'm a writer like he was, and I'm autistic as well. I understand the gaps in contact. He was kind, smart, sarcastic, and just a good guy. He loved baseball and metal detecting. On Find a Grave, his name is Simon Leslie Wright, Jr. He died February 12, 2019. Story 25. Turns out my grandma had a secret affair, and my mom is an illegitimate child. This completely shattered grandma and mom's relationship until grandma passed away about a month ago. Also, apparently, I'm a quarter Iranian. Story 26. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there, his troop found a baby that had been either orphaned or abandoned, they aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him, but my aunt said no. They'd only been married about 4 months when he was drafted, so while I don't agree with my aunt's actions and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him, and then to help him go to university, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the late 90s. My aunt and the rest of my family had no idea all this time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017, and she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for like 40 years and always noticed the money missing, but his reasons were always justified. Since we all know now, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family. They're all really lovely people. Edit to clarify as to why my aunt is a bad person in this instance. I was half asleep when I posted this and realized I left out a pretty important detail to explain why I don't like my aunt for this face bomb. To preface, I'm child-free, and if my husband was in this situation, I'd say no as well. It's not the fact she said no to adopting the kid that makes me dislike her for this, it's her reason. Anne is very racist against Asian people. Doesn't matter what part of Asia, she hates them. She's the kind of person who will yell, "Go back to your own country," at random strangers who even vaguely look like they may have Asian ancestry. She also cut contact with my cousin, her own daughter, because my cousin's husband is half Japanese. She said, in front of my family with no shame, that if the abandoned kid hadn't been Asian, she would have said yes to adopting him. Story 27. I grew up in a Mexican family and have 2 younger cousins. My aunt married another Latino guy who basically looked white. The oldest child was a girl and came out looking exactly like her dad. The second was a boy and came out looking like his mom. Maybe? He was dark. Like, I'm half black and this kid is darker than me. But his mom was pretty brown as well. So we thought nothing of it. Kid looks like his mom. Well, fast forward 16 years later. They're divorced and hate each other. The daughter was always treated like a princess. The boy was rather spoiled too, but very much sought out his dad's approval, which he just wasn't getting. He couldn't figure out why. He's acting out, getting in trouble, running with gangs. Boo-hoos about his dad all the time. Well, Dad had enough and flat out told him, "You're not my kid. Your mom is a hoe, and I don't know who your dad is." He even was kind enough to offer up a paternity test. His mother never said anything about it. She took the ostrich approach and hoped it would go away. We know now his dad was a Pacific Islander, and while there is one who has always been a family friend for many years, he took a paternity test too and was completely cleared. So the mystery remains on who she cheated on her ex with. She says she doesn't even know. Story 28. When my paternal grandfather died, the federal government reached out to do a state funeral. He's been a career Army and a colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came, and they went all out. Huge procession, people showing up who are really big names, like heads of departments, senators, retired senators, people from the CIA and State Department. It was nuts, and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key dude in the OSI during World War II, and when the OSI splintered into the CIA and Secret Service, he went the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the Army. For whatever reason, he told no one about all his covert work with the OSI and Secret Service, and the only person who knew, my grandmother, was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of cool shit like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various things he did and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking, and being a crotchety bastard. Turns out he was a bad MF, and all but none of us knew. Story 29. My de facto uncle, he and my aunt never married, but have been together since well before I was born, with a few hiccups, has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first it was a bit scandalous, but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age and they're best friends, go to the same high school, totally inseparable, technically aunt and niece. She comes to all our family events, and she's an awesome kid. We're all stoked to have her in our family.
That's it for now. See you in the next post.